Alan, as disappointing as everything already is, your outfit has now made it even more disappointing. I don't even want to know what you're wearing. Actually, I do. What is this?
Well, we're here to, talk to our friend Owen regarding, Russia and Ukraine. So I'm wearing my Ukraine colors and I'm drinking a Moscow Mule. So here we go. I'm ready to go. Is our guest ready to go?
I think you know exactly what's going on. We've got another no-show. I don't know what the hell is going on with the Sons of History podcast, but it's gotten
whoa. Our guest is a no-show?
Our guest is a no-show. And look,
I did all this. I put this on. I read my Russian. I've been going through all these books about Russia, Kievan Rus and Russian Empire, and and you're telling me that we have another no-show, and I'm sitting here dressed like this.
Yeah, this guy was supposed to be on the show. I gave him a raving review, and I had sent the email earlier this week, making sure that everything is on par, everything is set, ready to go, and we've got a no-show. Look, man, maybe it's me. Maybe maybe I emit a foul and offensive odor. I don't know what it is, but for those who are hanging out with us, regardless, if you haven't yet subscribed to our show and watch our episodes or listen to our episodes, whether our guests show up or not, because regardless, we do our best. We try to make every episode as enjoyable and as educational as possible. I remember Alan, season 1, always saying our goal is to educate and entertain, and that is the goal. So if you haven't,
I don't think we've lost sight of that. I think we're still on the right track. So.
Yeah, we're still on the right track. We've got Vladimir Zelensky, obviously, over there with with his green shirt
You
on.
like this?
Yeah, and that's the guy we're going to be talking about. Hey, look, whether or not Owen Matthews has shown up or not, we're still going to be having a discussion on the Ukraine-Russia war.
All right. Well, I'm wearing my Manhattan Project shirt. So, which, by the way, there's a movie about the Manhattan Project coming up in July 21st, in fact, by our good friend, what's that director's name? But it's got that guy from Batman. He plays Scarecrow.
I don't understand why you ask me a question and then you just keep talking. Christopher Nolan,
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the movie's coming out about J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project coming up in July. So I'm looking forward to that. So if we're going to talk about the Soviets or Russia or whatnot, I've got my Manhattan Project t-shirt.
Exactly.
And I still got my Moscow Mule.
Hey, I like how you went both sides, representing Russia and Ukraine. So good for you.
Well, this is going to be an objective, neutral stand on my part in regards to this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, same here. I'm gonna try to be as neutral about it as possible. Good guys, bad guys. They're all there. So, but it's the war of our day right now. So we need to talk about it. And I was really looking forward to talking to Owen because his book is really fascinating. Overreach. So if you haven't yet, if you haven't seen it, go look for it in the bookstores and go get it. I think you will find it fascinating and very educational as far as the history of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia and all that jazz, which you and I are going to talk about that. You know what I say? Let's just go ahead and start talking about it now. I had a series of questions that I was going to ask him, so we might as well just have that discussion because I think you and I have read up quite a bit on this subject. So so let's talk about the history of Russia and Ukraine. I know that was one of your questions that you really wanted to jump on. Let's start with that because we've talked about that in the past, just regarding sort of like the Vikings, even going back to the Viking days. So this goes back really, really far. So this is not something that is 19th or 20th century history.
Well, no, I mean, this does go way back. One of the I was gonna ask Owen a question regarding now. You and I we discussed this prior, so I'm gonna take kind of a neutral stand because I want to see the viewpoint of both sides, and we can play devil's advocate, and this is going to be a devil's advocate question right here, and maybe you can answer this, Dustin, because you did read Owen's book, but I want to look at things from Putin's viewpoint and Russia's lack of trust with the West. And there are several things that need to be addressed. We can't just sit and say, "Oh, Putin's evil, Russia's evil." There's a lot more to this. And we're going to begin with this. Kievan Rus. Now, Kievan Rus is the ancestral home of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. So, this is something that, it's kind of like the heart of the question with the Middle East, what's going on with the Middle East, where you have three different faiths all claiming Jerusalem as either their most important city or, in Islam's case, the third most important city. So Kievan Rus is going to be one of them. The next part would be whether we're talking about the division of Christendom between the Catholics, the Protestants, and the Orthodox Church. And there's also what was once known as the Great Game, which was a competition and a kind of a Cold War between Russia and England in the 1800s, where they were competing for not only Asia, but they were also competing with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which led to the Crimean War, where Britain and Russia went to war against each other, along with France in the Crimean War. And Britain's ally, Japan, went to war with Russia in 1904 and 1905. And then you had Germany attacking Russia on two different occasions in the two world wars. So, there was a suspicion against the West. Now, the West, after post-Soviet Union, the West sided against Russia and Serbia in the Chechenian Wars and the Yugoslav Wars, which resulted in the breakaway Republic of Kosovo during one of the Yugoslav Wars. Russia is a defender of Serbia because of the Orthodox Church. Now, you also had NATO expanding to its very borders and possibly looking at Georgia and Ukraine and partnering with other countries that were once Soviet states, such as Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan. Now, Putin and Russia also looked at things that Great Britain had done, which were similar to what Putin has done to some extent. Because of the expansion of NATO, Russia went into Ukraine because they felt like they were defending themselves against the NATO expansion. And it's similar to what Britain did to Iceland and Iran during World War II. A lot of people don't know this, but Britain invaded Iceland in 1940, and they invaded southern Iran along with the Soviets in 1941. And there were documents showing that Britain was going to invade Norway to fight Germany, but Germany actually beat them to the punch on April 9 of 1940. And finally, the West is turning weak, woke, decadent, and self-loathing, according to the Russians, while Red China, which wants Taiwan and possibly Siberia, because much of Siberia was once Chinese or under Chinese control or Mongolian control, China is growing stronger. So the question we have to ask is, aren't we alienating Russia and pushing them towards Red China? Isn't Putin's alliance with Red China, which will either prevent or postpone a Chinese takeover of Siberia, and his consolidation of Russia with Ukraine and Belarus, the smart move? Dustin, your thoughts?
My thoughts, like he does mention that a lot in his book. He covers all of those things. And I think here's what was interesting is that he would take some of what Putin had said about the West, like you said, being woke and decadent and everything. And it's just like, man, all that stuff rings true. And then you go back to the history of Russia and Ukraine being part of Russia. And so you sort of have this, history there of, well, like I think there are multiple camps there. Like people will say, well, and it's interesting you bring up the Middle East, right? Israel, the Jews say that Israel belongs to them because their history goes back further than, say, the Muslims, of course. And both of them are making that claim, but it's like, well, where does the claim actually land? Like, legitimately land? Does it land based on how far back you can put your history? Do you know what I mean? It's just like, just because you can go back 2,000, 3,000 years, well, does that really legitimately mean that, okay, that belongs to us because it used to belong to us? Like, I always am wondering, like, well, where does that come from? And they have in law, it's the Statute of Limitations, right? So is there sort of like a statute of limitations when it comes to going back and getting places that once belonged to you? When we had a guest on our show, I think a couple of seasons ago, he talked about China. Always, saying, well, that belonged to us at this specific time in one of our dynasties, so it still belongs to us, although it hasn't belonged to us in centuries, right? It's like, well, what's the statute of limitations? So I have to ask, does Russia actually have a legitimate claim on Ukraine? Or is like, look, man, that time has passed. And it's sort of like what Hitler did. It's like, now that's a shorter time period, obviously, but even with that, it's like, what's the statute of limitations? Obviously, there is no specific time, but what do you think? It's like, does Russia have a claim on Ukraine?
Well, I know that statute of limitations, from my understanding, is 100 years. I've heard that number being used, especially when the discussions. I think it was either I don't know if it was Moscow. I'm sorry, Mexico versus the United States, but I did hear that number being thrown out. Now, in terms of Russia claiming the Ukraine, they have worked together. They were part of the Soviet Union. They were one nation from when the Russian Civil War ended. Was it 1921, 1922, whenever it was. And the Soviet Union was one nation until it collapsed in 91, and then all the republics went their separate way. And I know that there has been that argument about Khrushchev giving, Soviet Premier Khrushchev giving Ukraine the Crimea. Here's where I'm going to answer your question. Legally, lawfully, I don't believe that Russia can sit there and claim Ukraine is ours, therefore we're going to invade. You and I discussed the possibility that, perhaps they need to work together because, let's face it, this is kind of a civil war. We've had a lot of countries. If you look at Israel, look at ancient Israel, it split into different countries. You had Judah and you had Israel. So they had differences and they split. You could have culturally the same group of people who split also. But how do you work it together? I mean, or how do they work together? Do we do like what Northern Ireland and Ireland did, where, we have an agreement that we're autonomous, and we recognize the fact that there are people with cultural and family binds between the two nations. So, okay, what's the chief complaint of the Russians who live in Ukraine? Are they being treated harshly? Are they not allowed to travel freely? Maybe that can be addressed so that you can still have autonomous states working together, kind of like how the United States was before the Constitution.
Yeah, and I think the culture. I think you hit on that with the culture, and that's another thing. It's like when we talk about like say the conflict between France and Germany with Alsace and Lorraine, like that was going back and forth, and then you had Hitler, who was Austrian, but obviously he spoke German as well. But he wanted everybody to be in this, the German Confederacy, more or less, like of old. He wanted to bring everybody back. And now you've got the former Soviet Union, and people say, well, Putin just wants to bring back the Soviet Union, whether that's true or whether that's not. And I think we need to address that pretty soon in this conversation. Is that really the goal? Because I hear that thrown out so often, like, well, the primary reason why Putin is doing what he's doing is so that he can regather the former states of the Soviet Union and revive the Soviet Union.
But is he? Is he really doing that?
Well, that's what I want to get on that in a minute. But it goes back to what you were saying about the culture, the cultural ties, and the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. It's just like, well, they both speak the same language. Their culture is, one is Catholic, one's Protestant, both Christian, but still, very separate. But in a lot of ways, their culture is very much the same. It's like, is that the ties that bind? And that's something that Putin continues to mention about the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And even Zelensky would speak in Russian whenever he would address the people of Ukraine and the Russians regarding this conflict. Like he would speak in Russian to sort of make that cultural connection there. But even then, it's like, is that enough to say, look, it's within the 100-year window. We have a lot of the same cultures. We speak the same language. We practice the same religion. So you guys just need to be part of us. And like, is that enough? I mean, obviously it's not enough. But it's like, where do you draw the borders? You know what I mean? It's like, it's so bizarre. It's like the only thing that really seems to cut everything off is the border, and then that's it.
Well, I do believe that you can have the same culture, the same language, the same everything, but you want to still have kind of a separation. And it's kind of like a family, if two brothers don't want to be ruled by the father when they get older. The United States, we were very similar to Britain when we separated, but we wanted a different system of government. We wanted a lot more individual rights than were given in Britain. And if you look at our Constitution, I don't even know. Does Britain even have a written constitution? I know they had the English Bill of Rights and all that, but I don't know much.
Their common law, more or less, is their constitution. Their constitution is based on the laws that are passed. So
okay, so they are constantly changing. They're not etched in stone like like our constitution is.
Right.
We have an amendment process, but it's very difficult to change our constitution. In the state of Texas, we're adding, amendments to the Constitution all the time. All you do, it's a simple vote. So you can have a separation. You can have autonomy. We have people who call themselves Ukrainians. We have people who call themselves Russians. But what is the beef with Putin? Why is he insisting that it be under one nation? Now, it's one thing to have hegemony, Russian hegemony over Ukraine. That's actually kind of expected, and I think for us to sit there and say you can't do that, that's pretty hypocritical, considering what not only the United States but many European nations have done, even including many Asian nations have done that. So is it right? I'm not saying that, but it's kind of expected. So if Russia has a legitimate beef. They don't want NATO in Ukraine, and they don't want NATO in Belarus. You know, NATO was originally formed in 1949 to put a check on the Soviet Union, which, you know, when NATO was formed, we had just at that time you had what was known as the Berlin blockade. You know, and if you've heard of the Berlin airlift, that's what that was. The Soviets blockaded Berlin, and the only way we could get in and out was through the airlift. So, you know, all the Western European nations were like going, you know, if the Soviets are going to do this, we'd better unite to put a stop to them. So that's how NATO was formed. Okay, well, you know, in '89, the Iron Curtain collapsed, and 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. But not only do we still have NATO, but NATO expanded. And, you know, in the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia. And he got along great with Bill Clinton. The two were almost like best buds. And, you know, Boris Yeltsin was in Houston. He went to a grocery store, I think it was in the Clear Lake area, and was just astonished with all the food that was available in that grocery store. He just decided, I'm going to go check out this grocery store. And he couldn't believe what he saw because it was nothing like what they had in Russia. And that, from my understanding, is what caused him to quit the Communist Party. But we had an opportunity to put Russia, Ukraine, possibly even Belarus, to put them as part of NATO. Because if there's no more Soviet Union, then why do we still have NATO? Now, Putin is sitting there probably asking himself that same question. Why is there a NATO? If it's to be an alliance of civilizations, decent civilizations, then they should have included us. But they didn't. But if it's now transformed from a defense against Russia, then he kind of has a legitimate concern about Ukraine being part of NATO. So I'm not sitting here, I'm not defending Putin, but if you're going to deal with someone like Putin, you have to think about what his thought process is. You can't just sit there and say, oh, he's evil, get rid of him. You know, because, you know, Zelensky isn't exactly an angel himself.
No, he's not an angel, and I do want to get on Zelensky and Putin with that. But, you know, I do think that Russia continues to be pushed in a corner. This is just my observation. I do think that Russia continues to purposely be pushed into a corner because the West needs a bad guy. And the thing is, like, there are plenty of bad guys to choose from. And to an extent, we've created some of them. We've made the situation in the Middle East worse than it has to be. I mean, you had the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, which, you know, extended for decades and now has made, you know, as we have seen over the past couple of decades, has actually stirred up the hornet's nest. And then you've got China. But China is such a manufacturing hub that we don't treat them anywhere near like we've treated Russia. And Russia has continued to be the whipping boy of the West. And this comes from just our culture, the Western culture, from, you know, Great Britain to America, where you are constantly putting Russia as the bad guy. Whether that's in your art, your entertainment, your news, your politics, everything, even sports. You think about it, like they're always, for some reason, a Russian athlete is always found, and it's typically an athlete that ends up winning like a gold medal or something, then they get the gold medal taken away from them because they're accused of doping. It's just like, if you're Russia, then you know that the Olympic Committee is going to keep an eye out on you more than probably anyone else to make sure that you're not doping. So why would you constantly do it?
But
this is my personal opinion. This is my personal opinion. I have zero proof to back this up, but this is a hunch. And I think in a lot of those instances, they weren't doping. I think it was just part of, let's continue to pile on and push Russia off to the side and continue to keep them as an enemy because, one, it's profitable in so many different aspects from media to the military.
But Red China doesn't deserve any credit as, that we made them into what they are. If, I hate to say it, but Red China, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is a bad guy. And regardless of what the United States did or does, they are a bad element. And the problem that I have is that we pushed, I hate to say it, and listen, you and I were both patriots, but something happened after the Soviet Union fell. We lost ourselves. I truly believe it. After the Soviet Union fell and the Iron Curtain fell, something happened where, whether it be globalists or whatever, we suddenly changed what our mission was to be, as a decent country and as a decent alliance, NATO and all that. And we should have done much to help Russia to become, to help them out, very similar to how we helped Germany and Japan and Italy to become part of Western civilization. Today, Germany, Japan, and Italy are allies of the West, allies of the Soviet Union. They're part of the West. We have very good relations with all three countries, which is what we should have done with Russia, but we didn't. We pushed them towards Red China. Now,
do you think we should have conducted almost like a Marshall Plan for the former states of the Soviet Union?
I have not thought much of it, and I might, as the what was that one girl who's the press secretary for Biden, where you might have to circle back on that one.
Jen Psaki.
Yeah, Psaki. Thank you. I do believe that I think extending invitations to the former Warsaw Pact countries to become part of NATO was a good idea. But I think we should have, number one, we should have extended that invitation to Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. Include them in the alliance because Greece and Turkey have a history of hostilities. And they're both part of NATO. Now, with the exception of what went on in Cyprus, and there might have been a skirmish here or there, Turkey and Greece have not gone to war with each other. They're not exactly the best of friends, but they haven't fought. And Germany and France have a history of hostilities. Even England and France have a history of hostilities, but they're all allies. They're all part of NATO. So had we, and Poland also, Poland doesn't have to worry about another German invasion because if Germany invades Poland for any reason, they want Danzig or Gdansk back because that's part of Prussia. All that area is part of Prussia. It's not going to happen because of the fact that they are allies and they're all part of the alliance. So we should have included Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and whoever else, Moldova and whatnot, included them as part of the alliance and used that against Red China because, let's not forget what happened at Tiananmen Square in '89. Taiwan, Free China, is our ally. The Republic of China is our ally, and we need them because of a lot of our, electronics, semiconductors, and whatnot. So I think we made a bad move. We made a very bad move, and we should not have sided against the Serbs in the Yugoslav war. We should have tried to create a peace settlement in terms of autonomy and what's that Wilson phrase? The
self-determination.
Self-determination. Leave it at that, and remain as allies.
Yeah, and that's because you brought up Catholicism, Protestantism, and the Orthodox Church, and you've brought this up before, I think in last season, about Putin must be wondering, like, why is the West, America in particular, supplying arms to the Muslims when you're supposed to be a Christian nation? And it's like, you know what I mean? It's like There's that conflict there that probably doesn't make much sense to Putin, and it doesn't make sense probably to a lot of Americans as well, especially because we've led the charge on the global war on terrorism, which is predominantly fought against Islamic radicalism. But I did want to mention maybe not a Marshall Plan version for Russia post the fall of the Soviet Union, but it is interesting how you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, which took place because the Russians, or the Soviets at the time, stood down. They just stood down and let the Russians, or the Berliners, if you will, take down the wall. And they stood down. Now, you bring up Tiananmen Square. It was like, okay, the Chinese were sensing, okay, there's something happening within the communist blocs. Now is our time to gain our freedom from under communism as well. And that was crushed, like literally crushed. And yet, in the next decade, America goes out of its way to bring China into the fold with everybody else, including having them part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And so now China, for a very long time, and they need to credit us specifically for their massive expansion of their economy, because they are a huge manufacturing hub, which, you check anything in your household and you'll find made in China, made in China, made in China. But we didn't treat the former Soviet Union, we didn't treat Russia the same way. We kept them at bay while we kept China in. And people may think, well, Dustin, the Soviets were always our enemy. This is true during the Cold War. Even during the hot wars, they were our enemy. They were often supplying, like the Koreans during the Korean War, the Vietnamese during that time. But at the same time, so were the Chinese. And the Chinese are the reason why there is still a North Korea and South Korea, because they sent like 300,000 Chinese soldiers into that war. And they also heavily assisted the Vietnamese. So it's like that right there, the China-Russia divide there shows the West's hypocrisy, I think, because both of those groups, both of those nations are quote unquote enemies of the West, and yet we have treated them very differently. And you see how the economy for China has boomed with the massive assistance of the West, while at the same time, Russia has not.
Yeah, and that never made sense to me. We are propping China up. They sent, I'm going to say it, Biden is a lackey for China, because they should have shot down that balloon from the very beginning instead of waiting until it crossed the United States, sending real-time information to Beijing. No, that just
yeah,
does
it's very
not fly with me.
frustrating. It's very angering.
Yeah, I mean the fact that we didn't want it to land on anyone and hurt anyone, and I'm sitting there going bullshit. There's a lot of land out there. There's a lot of farmland that they could have shot the thing down prior to it, crossing the entire United States and fulfilling its mission, sending information in real time. So by the time we shot it down over water, over the Atlantic, it finished its job. So, why are we propping up China? Why have we covered? We're going down a different route.
And I think it goes back to what I was saying as far as we are creating enemies. And America seems to be pretty good at doing that post World War II. For some reason.
Well, that's only because we became the superpower, and we were not the superpower prior to World War II. That was England, and England was making enemies.
Well, it's to your point, and I think it's spot on when you said after 1989, after the Cold War, after the fall of communism or the fall of the Soviet Union, we lost ourselves. We didn't know what to do, and there is a line from John Quincy Adams, who in one of his speeches that he says America is not the type to go out searching for monsters. I'm paraphrasing, to go out and search and vanquish monsters. But the thing is, we've gone away from that mentality, and we've gone out looking for monsters now. Especially in the 21st century, we are going out looking for monsters. And I think when the Cold War ended, I think there was a lot of disappointment there within the intelligence agencies and within the Pentagon that, man, this throws our military industrial complex on its head. Now what are we going to do? And I think, and I hate doing this because this is all circumspection, but I just think that the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies are like, we need to keep Russia as our enemy. We need to keep the Cold War going, even though it's over. And it sort of reminds me of what M says, I think, on, I want to say on Casino Royale, the James Bond movie. And she's like, Christ, I miss the Cold War. And I think that that's a very apt statement. I think that's where the West and its intelligence agencies are.
Well, George Washington quit the military in 1783 when the war was over. And he went home. And I think, this is my opinion, I think it was fine to continue with military research. We still needed to create weapons and better weapons because, we're gonna have enemies in the future. That's just, but
it is the way it is.
Yeah, I remember in the early 90s when we started closing down air bases, military bases around the country. I think maybe we should have closed down the military bases outside the United States and kept them here. Still kept, some kind of a military, but and yes, maybe leave the ones in South Korea, but the ones in Europe, my opinion, we should have shut them down. What's the point of having them in there? The one thing I love about Donald Trump is he told NATO, the NATO countries, why are we spending so much money defending you and you're barely putting anything in there? You guys need to pony up here. We're not going to do this anymore. And that's what we should have done. If we're going to expand NATO, fine, like I said, include Russia, close our air bases, or give them let Germany was that Ramstein, or I think Ramstein was one of the air bases. Why not just give them to the Europeans, close them down, bring our troops home? And at the time we did have a budget deficit. I think we had a budget deficit every year up until maybe in 95, 96. So we and not only that, we didn't need to make Saddam Hussein our enemy. I'm going to say that too, because look what happened after we removed Saddam Hussein. Was he a bad guy? Of course he was. But hell, half the leaders in the Middle East were bad guys. Almost every leader in the Middle East was a tyrant. But, Iraq was at least a check on Iran. Iran was our enemy. Iran is still our enemy. They've been our enemies since 1979.
And that's why I say I think the Pentagon and the military agencies the intelligence agencies want there to be this
yeah,
chaos.
We went looking for trouble. Okay, so Iraq invades Saudi Arabia. Well, there goes Wahhabism. Iraq was no Wahhabist nation. Saddam Hussein was not a fan of Wahhabism. Saddam Hussein was a modern Iraq leader who only thought of himself and his family. But, had he invaded, my opinion was that Iraq and Jordan would have both invaded because, Western Saudi Arabia used to be part of the Hashemite kingdom. If you ever watched Lawrence of Arabia, those were King Hussein and King Abdullah's family. They were in Western Jordan. And I'm sorry, the Western Saudi Arabia. This is before it was Saudi Arabia. It was Western Arabia was part of the Hashemite kingdom, and so they would have wanted to take over, their ancestral homes. So Jordan and Iraq invade, and then there we go. We got rid of Wahhabism. That's just like I said, just a thought. But we went looking for fights. We went looking for wars, and we kept screwing up everything.
Yeah, and whenever we couldn't find a fight, I think we just created them. There were two things that I wanted to mention because, and first I want to mention the policing where we have these bases all over the world. We have soldiers all over the world, and we are now. I mean, we're considered a superpower, obviously, but we're a policing nation. We are like the policing nation, and to your point, Trump pointed this out. It's like, okay, we're the policing nation, but we shouldn't be footing the bill for everything. You guys are taking a free ride. And indeed they were and continue to do so, right? Because nobody's there to really put the foot down. But it reminds me of the conversation I had with Frank Castigliola on George F. Kennan, who created the doctrine of containment during the Cold War. It's like after a while, after a few years, George F. Kennan was really against the idea of containment. He was like, hey, we eventually need to bring Russia to the table or the Soviet Union to the table and not have it to where we are citizens of the world are constantly thinking, all right, we're all going to be mutually destructed, right? And so mutually assured destruction. Well, it's sort of a catch-22. And I think part of it was the military-industrial complex was certainly against that. Like, no, this is one, job security, and two, it's a massive moneymaker for the arms race and the arms manufacturers. Two, if you get rid of the containment policy and then all of a sudden something terrible takes place, who's taking the blame for that? Like, nobody wants to take the blame for that. And I think to an extent, it goes back to what we have now with the policing. We are a policing nation. We are, quote unquote, that nation which keeps the peace in the world. Although we're obviously not, the world is not at complete peace. But with that, it's like, okay, it's bad to an extent right now. But if we bring everybody home, what if it gets really bad? What if World War III breaks out? That type of thing. And I think to an extent, there's another catch-22. It's one, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, they don't want to get rid of the policing nation. They don't want to draw the troops home. They don't want to end the skirmishes, and they don't want to end the purchasing of military equipment. And with that as well, they don't want to take the chance of, if we do a drawdown, what the hell is going to happen then? Because that's a future that you can't see. And I just spit, but that's fine.
Well,
Do you agree
you can
with that?
still, like I said, you can still invest in advanced weaponry. But, think of the money you save. Then you don't have to sit and worry about the budget when it comes to advanced weaponry. If we've sent all our troops home, they can be with their families. Okay, we're gonna position you someplace closer to home. You can live with your families, kind of like working from home. Hey, it works out for me at least, working from home, and just cut down on the budget, cut down on the defense budget, and concentrate, like I said, on advanced weaponry so that should there be a war, let's face it, Americans love their guns, and Americans love to go shooting, so if a new war breaks out, wouldn't take us that long to train our people. We'd still have a military, we'd still have a volunteer military, and I'm not suggesting that we cut back on and say, well, you have to quit or anything like that. I don't even know what our numbers are right now in terms of the volunteer military, but it is a volunteer military. But you just have them stationed here. You have them stationed on our southern border, not to process illegal aliens, but to put a stop to them, keep them from invading our country. That's what our military should be doing. Instead
Right.
of instead of and not only that, but Red China sends representatives all over Africa right now, and they're establishing relations with these African nations, better relations. John F. Kennedy started the Peace Corps, and I thought that was a good thing. You want to you want to build relations with all these countries, help them to become better developed, and then you have your allies right there. And then what we can do is instead of this country concentrating so much on weaponry, we can, again, hey, I'm going to keep repeating this. We can still work on advanced weaponry so that we can have the best military in the world. Because, yes, we're going to have enemies in the future. That's just human nature. It's going to happen. We're going to go to war again sometime. I don't know when. But if we establish a peace corps, if we, don't dump money everywhere like we're doing to Ukraine right now. What is it, 170 billion? Is that how much money we've given them so far? While the U.S. dollar is plummeting and we're nearing somewhere around $35 trillion debt, which is causing inflation.
I think you're spot on. I think too often America is so powerful, so wealthy, that a lot of times we go to these other small countries, and instead of creating allies, we create sort of subjects, where people we look upon, and I'm not saying the people, the citizens, but our governments look upon these groups as subjects rather than allies. And I think creating, like, doing the Peace Corps thing and just going in like, hey, we're going to help y'all develop whatever it is that can be developed. And we have to understand that there are some countries that cannot do certain economic practices. They can't perform in certain industries because their sources are just not there. And if you've not watched our interview with Peter Zion last season, I think people should look at that and understand, like, America is in a great place geographically. We have so much at our fingertips that we can create so much on our own. There are tons of nations, probably a vast majority of nations, who just can't do that, whether that's because of space or whether that's just because of, hey, you guys don't get any rain, or you get too much rain, or it's just a lot of differing circumstances. But I did want to discuss, you mentioned Zelensky and Putin. Here are my thoughts. Here's my primary thought on Zelensky. And I know a lot of people in the conservative movement don't like Zelensky. Okay, whatever. Here's what stood out to me. When the American troops withdrew from Afghanistan, that president, that man in power, took millions of dollars on a plane and left. Zelensky was offered multiple times leading up to and after the invasion by Russia to hop on a plane with his family and leave, come to America, come somewhere in the West. He stayed. He stayed with his troops, his inner circle, and he stayed in the capital and fought, like literally fought. Like, this is a guy who, for all his supposed ills and mistakes, and his past of being like an entertainer, and people try, they pull in the conspiracy theory of, well, he did a show about a guy who was on a reality show who wanted to be the president, and voila, look at that. It's like, yeah, that is very interesting. I agree. But at the same time, Zelensky was a guy who was fed up with where his country was headed. Did he do everything right? No, he didn't. But I'll tell you what he did do right. He stayed. He stayed and he fought. and he encouraged his own people, the Ukrainian people, to stay and fight. And for that, I've got massive respect for him. It doesn't mean that I will, turn a blind eye to other things. And there are things that our country has done with Ukraine and Zelensky in particular that I don't agree with. But I like Zelensky. I like what he did. And for my money, for a guy who stays in a place where they've got assassins running around looking to kill this guy, he gets all the respect in the world from me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think Zelensky has balls, and the fact that he stayed. Listen, I have a buddy of mine who's fighting in Ukraine right now. He lived here in Houston. We're very good friends. I've reached out to him a couple of times, although I haven't talked to him in a while. But he's there. He's there in the fight, and that's the thing about Zelensky that I did, like you were saying. He didn't leave. The women and children left, and the men were told to stay, which is what it should have been. The men needed to stay and fight, because I don't want American troops out there fighting. I don't think NATO troops should be out there fighting. They're not part of NATO. If they were, then yeah. If Russia invaded Poland or the Baltics, absolutely. We've made a commitment. Now, whether it's the right type of commitment, that's a whole different story. You look at like what happened in 1914 when Germany invaded Belgium to get to France. Was that a smart move for Britain to have been in such a commitment? No, but they were, and they ended up losing about 800,000 men for it, or maybe might have been over 1 million. I'm not exactly sure, but Zelensky stayed and he fought, and I didn't agree with a lot of the other things that he has done. He's not a Democrat, not like an American Democrat, but a Democrat in terms of someone who believes in a democratic form of government. He is an authoritarian, but he's our authoritarian, as Franklin Roosevelt used to say.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to that point, I think that's another thing, because I saw that and I was like, yes, there is credence with that. But we have to understand, Ukraine was part of the Soviet bloc. Those former states of the Soviet Union were more or less forced out of communism. So it wasn't like when America fought their revolution, right? It's not like that. Or it's not like, post World War I or post World War II, where you already have democracy set up and people have been practicing it for a long time. These are countries that were in the polar opposite end of what a democracy was. And so over just a short period of time, these former Soviet states are becoming democracies. And for my money, for people to think that they should be on par with the West, with places like America or Canada or Great Britain or Australia, places like that, no. Like, it's just not going to happen, at least not yet. They are still in a maturing stage, and when it's like, and I know you got something to say, but it's like you would have to fight everything within your nature to ensure, like, okay, look, I know that these publications, or I know that these churches or whatever, they're actually speaking out against what we're doing, and what we're doing is for the betterment of the country, but we got to shut these people down. And for you and I to sit here, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I don't want to put you in a corner, okay? But for you and I to sit here and say, and we've got friends who have said the same thing, for us to sit here and say, how can we consider this Ukraine to be a democracy and for him to be a democratic president? I don't think so. He's shutting down media outlets. He is shutting down churches, blah, blah, blah. Like, people who are dissenters are like, didn't we do that in the 19th century and the 20th century?
Well, all right.
And how long had we been practicing democracy? 200 years? 300 years?
Do I have to say it that we're not a democracy?
I'm saying practicing democracy.
Well, democratic form of government. But what I will say...
But what I'm saying is, like, that there's a difference. We're a republic,
I know,
but we
I know
practice...
what you're saying. I know what you're saying, but keep in mind, okay, yes, and that excuse was used when, many of when World War I ended, and all, Austria-Hungary was broken up, and Imperial Germany was broken up, and Ottoman Empire, and all the, now you had all these countries. And, the argument has been that they didn't quite understand the whole concept of a democratic form of government. They were used to an authoritarian, whether it's a kingdom or an empire controlling them. And that's how, a democratic form of government didn't quite work out. Now, when World War II ended, now the United States, when we were actually doing some smart things back then, we forced pretty much Germany and Japan. Let's just stick with Germany and Japan for right now. Germany and Japan became model democratic nations. They formed a good democrat, and not only that, but we withdrew our soldiers from Japan, which I think it was in 1952. And the occupation ended. We were there for 7 years, and we're like, okay, you're on the right path. We have set in stone this democratic form of government, and now, we had bases in Okinawa, but they did. The Soviet Union fell 31 years ago, so they've had 31 years to get something right. Get it perfect? No. The United States created a democratic form of government. In 1776, we had a democratic form long before that, but we created a democratic form. We created a democratic form of government and a republic, a constitutional republic that has endured. And did we mature? Yeah, it took. The black people couldn't vote. Oh, what was that? About 90 years later. And then women began to vote in 1920, I think in the 1920 election. So we created a system of government that hadn't existed before. So, but the problem is like with Ukraine is they're not exactly maturing. They're not going anywhere. They're staying stagnant. They shut down the Russian Orthodox Church. You couldn't be arrested for speaking out against Zelensky. You could be arrested if you were trying to run the church. So that's not. No, you can't excuse that. They know that that's wrong. There's enough information. There's enough knowledge from Western Europe, from the United States, for them to know that it's wrong. Follow the principles of freedom.
Well, that
individual rights. There's enough material out there for them to know what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah, but that would make it to where what America has created. Look, I am, I believe that the Bill of Rights, our Constitution, is the gold standard. But what you're saying is, if they looked at what we do, free speech, the Bill of Rights stuff, right? If they looked at what we did, then they would know that they are wrong. And I disagree with that. Freedom of speech is not, quote unquote, when it comes to, you can't speak against this in this specific times. Like, that's not, quote unquote, democracy. Democracy is being able to vote for those who are going to be in power and running the government over you. So the whole freedom of speech that's something that we partake in. Like the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. That's something pretty much just here. Like you take, for instance, Australia. That's a democratic nation, and very much in the way of how we run our business, or specifically, Britain has always run their business, right? Like they don't have guns. And you would make the same argument probably like, dude, if they need to look at us. They know that this is what they should be doing. We are the gold standard. And to an extent, like, that is positing the gold standard with us being it. And it's just like, not everybody agrees with that. And so when it comes to what Ukraine is doing, you say it's stagnant, and, yeah, sure, it's stagnant in a number of areas, but to say that they are sort of mimicking what we did in the Adams administration and the Wilson administration, hey, a lot of people think that we were freer during that period of time, both of those period of times, than we are right now. So,
well,
I don't know.
I understand about the whole corruption thing, especially with a lot of the stuff coming out with what the FBI has been doing, And there's been
that's
a lot,
what I'm saying, dude.
There has been a lot coming out that's really shows how corrupt our this regime that we currently have in the White House.
And so it sort of brings to the point. It's like, country. Are we the gold standard still?
What's that?
I mean, it brings up the point again. Like, are we the gold standard still? Maybe the Bill of Rights is. Maybe the Constitution is, and I truly believe that it is.
Our system is. It's our leaders who are not.
It's how it's been corrupted. And I will say this, like, why have they not changed Russia, Ukraine? Why have they not changed? Like, here's why I think, to an extent, because you brought up, I think, Germany and Italy, I want to say, I can't remember, but I think you brought up Germany, and like, hey, they've developed these, or no, Japan and Germany, my bad. They've developed these democracies, like, they've done well, and they've improved. It's like, yes. And the thing that hit me was there's a difference in the outcome of those two, let's say those two wars. We never bombarded and destroyed the eastern side. We never went in and absolutely bombarded and destroyed Russia, right? Now, obviously the Germans did, right? But we did go in and absolutely destroy Germany and Japan. And it's like, where are you going to go from here? Are you going to play by our rules? And to an extent, Russia didn't have to do that because they were already our ally. They moved out of that role, but there's a difference in bombardment and destruction and espionage. And that's the worst of what took place between us and
But
the
that's
Soviet
not going to
Union,
work
was
if you're
espionage.
looking at if you look at Poland, the Baltic nations, Romania, the Czech Republic. They have democratic forms of government that they were under Soviet hegemony for 45 years, 44 years. So
right. And how well are they doing?
They're doing better than Ukraine.
They may be doing better than Ukraine, but like, they're not doing great. They're doing all right.
Well,
but that's like saying, Russia's doing great. Like, Russia was, that's a hit or miss.
I'm not talking about their economics. I'm talking about their...
I am.
Okay.
My apologies. I sort of was.
Yeah, economics. I am not following the economics of Poland or any of the other former Warsaw Pact countries. What I am looking at is, are they following? I don't want to sit and say they're following in the footsteps of the United States. We have, I think, right now, the best system. The unfortunate thing is we don't have leaders. We don't have very good leaders running things. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, it protects our individual inalienable rights, and that right there is what's so great about our country. It's the leaders that suck. So. And I'm not going to sit here and say, well, Zelensky and all them should have gotten better. What I am saying is that the system of government in the Ukraine, I keep calling it the Ukraine, it's now called Ukraine, in Ukraine should have, gotten better. There should have been, kind of a evolutionary, if that's the right word, an evolution in the government system in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. But it hasn't. What I'm seeing in Russia is where they have to defend themselves now against the West. They feel like they have to defend their system against the West. And this is where fascist societies come in. It's kind of like when you had the Spanish Civil War, where it was obvious that the country was moving to a leftward position based on, well, whoever, like when a leftist ran the country, they were forcing it upon all the different provinces of Spain. Well, what happened was you had the Spanish Civil War, you had the right wing, they won, Francisco Franco won in 1939, and so in order to protect it from becoming a left of center country, they created a fascist system of government. You know, that's why Germany, when Hitler took over, Germany was in his mind, in his view, that they needed to protect the Germans from communism and from Jewry. So they created these really sadistic laws to defend what they thought was how they wanted to rule their country. And Russia's doing the same thing right now.
Exactly, and I do want to have a conversation about that. I'm going to pose a question. It's going to be the last question, so we can wrap up. But I would like to have a conversation on the rise of fascism, and because I do think it is making a bit of a comeback because there is the rise of socialism / communism, and those two are back, competing with each other. It's really wild. Okay, my last question for you. How do you think peace can be achieved between Russia and Ukraine? And does that peace look like two separate nations? Or do they have to come together?
There's different ways that it can happen. Now, I don't know what is going on with the Biden regime in terms of what their end goal is. They may be trying to force the Russians to have a coup d'etat and kill Putin, or maybe they're expecting the Russian economy to collapse. There are. Here's how you have peace. Either you're going to have a surrender by Ukraine, you're going to have a coup d'etat. You could have an armistice, but that's not going to settle anything. Here's what I think is the way to fix it. They need to recognize that both sides have legitimate grievances. You can't just dismiss it by saying, oh, they're evil. There are Russians who are living in parts of Ukraine that Russia is wanting to annex. Okay, what is their beef? Is there a problem? Are Russians treated harshly in Ukraine? If they are, then they're causing the problem themselves. They brought all this on themselves. At least the government did. The Ukrainians don't want to be part of Russia. But the Ukrainians and the Russians have a lot of bonds. If I were president of the United States, I would, recognizing that Russia has legitimate claims to what was once Kievan Rus, and the Ukrainians have a legitimate gripe that we are an autonomous nation and we don't want Russia, we don't want to be a puppet of Russia. So what you end up doing is, in my opinion, is you're going to have something similar to the Good Friday Agreement between the two Irelands, or the fact that in the United States we have 50 states. Well, Texas and Louisiana, for instance, Texas has its own government, Louisiana has its own government. But you know what? Any day of the week, I can just get in my car and drive to Louisiana. I can move to Louisiana. I don't have to show papers. I may have to change my address, my driver's license, and be a Louisiana resident. But, this is a civil war. Just create two autonomous nations, but allow the people to come and go as they please, have a strong economic have a strong economic ties, and don't dismiss, address the grievances between the two sides. Get them together, get them to talk. it can be done.
Yeah, no, it can be done. And I think ultimately the powers that be, i.e., NATO, they don't want it to be done. Because if you ended up doing something like that, that would set a precedent that would undermine NATO and the UN. The UN doesn't want it to be done either, I don't think. And it sets a precedent that says, wait a minute. If we can take these two longtime enemies with such bad blood, but common bond still, and we can create a peace between those two, why do we need the UN and the NATO? Why can't we just have people step in and do this? And people will make a legitimate argument. It's like, well, Ukraine would not have lasted nearly as long if they weren't supplied by the West and by NATO. Like, yeah, that's true. But it's something to be said. It's like, yeah, just bring those two together. Let both air their grievances and let those grievances be known and accepted and understood, and then try to move forward. My concern, and we mentioned this at the very beginning of the show, is China will once again broker a peace deal between those two. And that will definitely push Russia into the arms of China and possibly Ukraine. And then what are you going to have? Because Ukraine's still not part of NATO.
Well, Russia's already in China's arms.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just saying, like, that will solidify a right there.
Well, yeah, because the Saudi Arabia and Iran have formed a peace agreement brokered by China.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like, they'll again broker another peace. So who knows, man? That was I enjoyed the conversation. That is it for the show, ladies and gentlemen. We hope that you enjoyed it. If you haven't yet, subscribe to us wherever you're listening or watching, and like, comment, leave a rating and review if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. And that's it for us. Owen, dang, man, we really wanted to talk to you, but hey, we had a good conversation anyways. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. We hope you have a great week.